Inflation in New Zealand is currently going up. It's 2.7%, right? But we're spending less. We're cutting investment. We're doing the opposite of what the previous government did. We're taking away investment. So how does that work if inflation's going up now, but we got less investment? Because now apparently it's international factors that are to blame, much as the previous government tried to say it was international factors. But at that point in time, the now opposition said, no, it's due to too much spending. On the IMF's net debt measure, New Zealand's debt is 23% of GDP. Yeah? In Australia, it's 30. In the UK, it's 92. In the US, it's 95 and going north with Donald Trump. In Japan, it's 135% of GDP, right? We don't have a debt crisis in New Zealand. We do in New Zealand have an investment crisis because we don't have the schools, the hospitals, the roads, the other things that we should do. Kia ora koutou, and a warm welcome to episode 18 of Locked Out with Craig Renney. By day, I'm the economist and director of policy at the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. But by night, this podcast looks at the numbers in New Zealand and asks the hard questions so that you can too. We hope that you're enjoying the show and what we do at Locked Out. If you like the analysis you hear on the show and think that others would do too, then recommend us to your friends or even your enemies. Also, give us a recommendation wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps get the word out. Here at Locked Out, we're always interested in what our viewers and listeners want to know. If it's making you say, do you think the latest political polls are affecting the government? You can be in no doubt we are too. So get in touch. I'm on X, I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm on Substack. We want to hear how we can help you better understand what's really going on and to help you navigate the numbers being thrown around by politicians and experts alike. Now, on the first part of this show, I'm talking with Gerard Otto, my colleague and friend, about the Treasury's latest, what we call the long-term insights briefing. Let's talk with Gerard now. Kia ora everyone. I'm joined today by my colleague, fellow broadcaster, and an all-round economics nerd, Gerard Otto. And I brought Gerard on because Gerard spotted something that I had spotted in terms of a document called the Treasury's long-term insights briefing. And this is a document produced on a sort of on a regular basis by the Treasury, looking at a particular issue and asking the questions, what does that issue mean for the long run in New Zealand? The Treasury in the past has looked at health. It's looked at a range of other fiscal pressures. But this time round, the Treasury is looking at basically what is the role of fiscal policy, i.e. spending, saving, taxation, whenever there's a downturn or a crisis, and what should be the role of Treasury and the government in helping to manage that. So thank you, Gerard, for coming onto the show.
Oh, thank you, Craig. It's really good to be here on Locked Out. And I'm really keen to get stuck into this topic because it's a hot potato that's been shipped around, particularly in mainstream media in the last week or so. And I'm seeing it being used as some kind of vindication for a narrative that I don't think is 100% true about the way in which we should move forward in terms of managing economic cycles, should there be an emergency or a crisis, and also to justify a narrative that's the blame game about Labor overspending during the COVID pandemic. And I think this interview could shine some light upon why that might not be the case.
I couldn't agree more. Sort of, I worked in the Beehive for 3 years as the advisor to Grant Robertson. I've seen a lot of Treasury documents, but I saw this one and I thought, oh, it'll be another dull but worthy document. But it was a straight up ideological burp, as Seneca Cullen would say. It's a straight blast from the past. It's like the 1980s never went away. I mean, the first thing it says is that this is about the role of fiscal policy through shocks and business cycles. Right. So just to be clear for the audience, a shock is an unexpected event that has a really big impact on the economy. COVID was a shock. Oil prices going up would be a shock. The business cycle is just the normal ups and downs of the economy. And normally the economy moves in long cycles, 8 to 10 years, and you have an upswing when things are going great, and you have a downturn when things aren't so great. In New Zealand, by tradition, years ending in 8 don't end so well. But those are the two things, and it's asking what is the role of fiscal policy and hence the role of government in that space. But the first thing it says is cyclical management, which essentially is the management of those risks, should mostly be left to monetary policy run by an independent reserve bank. So the government has no role.
So for those that don't know what fiscal policy is versus monetary policy, let's pick up what the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy is, just so that everyone who's new to these concepts actually understands that.
It's a great question. So fiscal policy, as I say, it's the role of spending by government, and that can involve taxation, that can involve a direct investment, borrowing. It can also involve shifting investments into new areas or moving money around so that you can help stimulate the economy. If you're building roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, that's often seen as a public investment. Monetary policy is the use of by the Reserve Bank of interest rates and what we call macroprudential tools, banking regulations, to manage the flow of credit in the economy. Monetary policy is direct spending by the government. Monetary policy is the management often of private credit in the economy.
Thanks for that. So let's just say what you just said again. Cyclical management should mostly be left to monetary policy run by an independent central bank. That's what the Treasury long-term insights briefing says as one of its findings. So how wrong is that finding, and why is it wrong, Craig?
It's difficult to be more wrong than it currently is. You've got to think about it. The job of government is to manage cyclical pressures in the economy. It has to be the job of every organ of government to manage the business cycle. If you can see that demand is falling away, government might want to manage that both with monetary policy via the Reserve Bank doing things, but it might also want to spend some money. It might want to deliver tax changes to encourage more investment. It might want to directly invest itself to help support struggling industries or struggling sectors or struggling places. If you're delivering training and development policy, you often want to think about that to help manage the peaks and troughs in the economy, because we see construction sector rise, we can't get the staff. The construction sector falls, all those staff leave for Australia, and we just keep repeating that cycle. When you talk about managing, the need for investment in the energy sector, because we haven't had any investment in New Zealand in decades in the energy sector, that's in essence cyclical management. That's managing the ups and downs in the economy. If you don't do that, you're essentially encouraging those ups and those downs. You want to act often counter-cyclically, so against what's happening generally, to flatten out those cycles so that people aren't hurt, the families aren't impacted by those changes, and we want to manage that risk. And that's the job of good government. It's not the job of one bit of government to do that.
That's right. You wrote a devastating critique of this long-term insights briefing from Treasury on Substack, and you used a very, very good example about how monetary policy, if we were to use that mostly and ignore fiscal policy, like the Treasury are kind of recommending here, you used the example of one region of New Zealand, like the South Island, versus another. Could you talk to that kind of example of why you just can't rely on monetary policy and you have to have an active fiscal management?
So as my accent gives away, Gerard, I'm from the northeast of England. And in the 1980s, the northeast of England, like much of the rest of the north of the country, was really struggling with deindustrialization, underinvestment, job losses. The south of the country, particularly London and the southeast, had an enormous boom. The financial markets had been liberalized. There was money everywhere. The economy was going gangbusters. Now, we have one interest rate across the country, just like New Zealand, because we have one currency. Now, if you increase the interest rate, as the UK did, to manage inflationary pressures from the bit of the country that's booming, then you make it harder for those bits of the economy to grow where they're really struggling. If you cut the interest rate to help those bits of the economy that are struggling to grow, then you make the boom somewhere else completely unsustainable. Now, we suffered from that in the north of England for about 25 years, and we're still bearing the scars of much of that deindustrialization and lack of economic development precisely because of that challenge. In New Zealand, if you had a disaster that befell a place, or you had one area of the country that was going gangbusters economically, if you used the OCR, the other parts of the country would suffer as a consequence of that use of that tool. That's why fiscal policy is really important, to help manage that difference, to help make sure you've got other tools at your disposal, and to help make sure that communities and workforces and places don't suffer as a consequence of national level tools being used on areas that have different economic outcomes.
Yeah. Now, let's get back to some basics here. They've released this long-term insights briefing, and what's it really about and why is it really important?
Well, why it's really important is because essentially this briefing, and if we go to slide 1 so everyone can see what it looks like, that's this document here, the Treasury's long-term insights briefing. It's really important because what it's telling us is that the government's approach to management during cycles is essentially to say, we're not going to do anything. We're going to allow the Reserve Bank to operate. We think that fiscal policy should operate in the background. We should manage our affairs really well. We should build up financial buffers for the future to help manage that change. And as a consequence, fiscal policy, active government policy, has little to no real role to play. We should use monetary policy. Now, monetary policy, by convention, takes about 2 years in order for it to be felt in the economy. You make a decision on the OCR, it takes 18 months to 2 years to be felt in the real world. Now, the reason why the Treasury has taken this approach, and this is what the slide on the screen here is saying to us, is because it's worried that debt is growing again as a percentage of GDP. And you can see on the blue line on the screen, and for those of you who are listening or not able to watch it, there's a blue line on the screen which represents debt GDP, and a red line which is the more, and a green line which is the more modern definition of debt GDP. And they both wobble around, but they peaked in 1992, and then it fell consistently to about 2009 when we had the GFC. Started to rise again post the GFC and the Canterbury earthquake sequence. It started to fall again then, and then obviously post-COVID has risen again. And the Treasury's concern is that at each point debt has gone up because we haven't made savings. Except, of course, the Treasury's own chart, as highlighted by the 2 red circles here, is that debt to GDP fell after the Asian financial crisis consistently to the GFC. And then it fell after the Christchurch earthquake sequence till we had the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Treasury is identifying a problem that doesn't exist in the real world.
Yeah, it's contradicting itself, isn't it? It's kind of, here's the record in the red circles.
And the challenge we have,
not true.
And the challenge we have being that the because of that decision by the Treasury to essentially ignore their own history and ignore their own data, they've decided that we can't afford more fiscal policy if we have another disaster. Except the historic record in New Zealand has been that we've, under Sir Michael Cullen, we almost paid off the national debt. National debt was so close to 0% of GDP. It was crazy. Even the national debt was falling. Debt to GDP was falling under the pre-COVID period under Grant Robertson after the 2017 election. It fell to 18%. So well below the 20% threshold the Treasury thinks or thought at the time was important. Now it's gone up since COVID. Unsurprisingly, we spend a lot of money to keep people in work, to keep businesses going, to keep things happening. But the Treasury now believes that it will never get back to growth. And of course, why that's important is because the Treasury now believes that the only way to actually achieve sustainability in the Crown's accounts, and we'll gloss over whether or not that sustainability is true or not, is to make continued fiscal consolidation, which is Treasury code for more cuts. So we're not going to grow the economy. We're going to cut spending to create space. In creating that space, that then allows us to have another disaster without the books getting out of control. It's essentially the Treasury putting the books first and the country last, rather than putting the country first and the books last.
In the paper, you mentioned the idea that Treasury are basically sort of running away from fixing the problems that we might have to do with 2-yearly lagged effects when it comes to some of our policies and a hollowing out of investment. Could you talk more about how we could fix it and what Treasury is saying in their insights briefing paper?
Yeah, sure. So the Treasury's briefing paper says it makes essentially a statement rather than an evidence-based statement. It asserts that many elements of fiscal policy operate with significant lags, for example, due to longer policy design and legislative processes. And I mean, that's fine. If you need to change the law, that's often, you need to go to the House. That can take quite a long time, even though, New Zealand has some of the fastest legislation anywhere in the world. And it provides some examples of some COVID spending that took a long time to actually process to that end. But I mean, that's fine, but that's not a reason for giving up on fiscal policy. One of the key lessons that we took away from COVID, one of the lessons I learned from delivering COVID management, was we had hollowed out government expertise, government spending plans, government's ability to plan, to the extent that when we needed to make decisions really quickly, we often did, but not with the kinds of design or expertise or the kinds of insight that we might have liked. It's the job of Treasury, if nobody else, to have lists of things to spend money on if you need to in a hurry. It's the job of Treasury to say these are the most important things to be investing in, and we can if we need to right now. It's the job of various departments to say, okay, if I needed to spend cash, what would be the next $3 billion of expenditure that I need to do, and how would I do it? Right? And that's the job of government. It means for the Treasury, it means spending more time on that rather than less, rather than just saying it's too hard, let's not do it, let's chuck it in the bin, let's just let the Reserve Bank deal with that because it takes too long. You should be able to plan for this, right? You should be able to make sure that you know what you need to spend money on. That not only benefits us when there's a disaster, that actually benefits us right now, because we'd have a better idea of what we need to spend money on. We'd have a better idea of the options that are open to government about what it should be investing in today. But simply putting fiscal policy in the too hard basket, that's just accepting a failure. I don't think we should accept. And certainly we shouldn't just be putting that in the lap of the Reserve Bank and then saying, that's your problem now, you fix it via movements in the interest rate, rather than us knowing what to do if we need to do something in a hurry.
Let's talk about a practical example of a disaster. If a disaster was to befall New Zealand, could you talk us through what might happen if we just followed Treasury's advice and we just left everything to monetary policy here?
It's a great question, because one of the things you can imagine the Treasury using this as a manual for there's a disaster, right? And so it says, right, fiscal policy is going to stay in the background. So spending, revenue, investment, that's all going to stay in the background. We're going to primarily use the Reserve Bank's interest rate lever to help manage our responses to that disaster or to that business cycle event. Now, typically, if there's a downturn, and we'll use that as the example here rather than an upturn, but in a downturn, the people start to become unemployed. There's less demand in the economy. Taxation starts to fall. The Reserve Bank would start thinking, oh, hang on, what's happening to inflation? Now, it might be a while before inflation starts to fall. And as a consequence, in the short run, the Reserve Bank does nothing. The Reserve Bank just sits there and says, we're going to leave it alone because our job is to manage inflation. It's not to manage the business cycle. More and more people start to become unemployed. more businesses start going to the wall. And it's only when it becomes really critical and inflation starts to fall that the Reserve Bank says, oh, okay, we now might start to do something. But it takes 18 months to 2 years for that something to turn into something in the real world. As a consequence, there's an awful lot of jobs, an awful lot of livelihoods, an awful lot of businesses that can disappear whilst we're waiting for that Reserve Bank activity to manifest in the real world. And there's an awful lot of pain that can then get caused. Now, if we'd used fiscal policy, if we'd gone against the Treasury's advice, we could be supporting businesses. We could be investing in things whilst there's a downturn to help stimulate the economy, to keep things going, to build the schools and the hospitals that we know we actually need, to keep jobs in New Zealand, to shorten the size of that business cycle going up and down. But if we just used the tools as suggested by the Treasury, one, we'd have better accounts, probably, because we hadn't spent any money, but we'd also have an awful lot more unemployed people. We'd have an awful lot more economic loss. People's incomes will be affected hugely. And as a consequence, it's dangerous just to rely upon the one lever, because if we do, we're setting ourselves up for more pain than we would do if we had a more sophisticated approach where monetary policy and fiscal policy were working in tandem with each other.
The paper makes a number of conclusions that are actually at odds with its own evidence in key areas. Can you talk to us about some of those contradictions and failures by Treasury to consider Treasury's own evidence?
No, you're right. It's sort of, it's funny, right? Sort of the paper essentially reduces the role of the government to being essentially a role I think of as being a canny janitor, right? Someone who saves up and then tidies up after the mess. The government's a passive player rather than an active, agent for change, right? And the best example of this is where the Treasury talks about what might you do if you are forced to use fiscal policy in the event of a disaster. And they talk about the value that lump sum payments might make in this space. But they also then say altering public consumption, which is spending on maintenance or buildings, is typically not proposed, as such changes can be difficult to reverse once implemented. Now, we'll leave aside the fact that democratically elected politicians get to make that choice, not the Treasury or the Reserve Bank, but we'll leave that aside for 1 second, right? The Treasury's own modelling says that doesn't work. And if we go to the next slide on the screen, what we can see is the Treasury models 3 stimulus packages: a lump sum payment equivalent to 2% of GDP, public maintenance expenditure, again, equivalent to 2% of GDP, and business investment tax changes, again, equivalent to 2% of GDP. Cumulative real GDP changes are best under public maintenance. The unemployment rate falls fastest with public maintenance. CPI goes up more under public maintenance, but only by 0.1%. Right? Net debt, the thing that the Treasury says it cares about all the way through this document, is lower under public maintenance expenditure than it is under any other form of stimulus package. It's difficult to imagine that, or it's difficult to reconcile that with the rest of the statements in here. And it's very difficult to not assume that lump sums are preferred simply because it means there's no role for the government in helping to deliver economic development activity. It's just chuck some money out of the door, let the private sector deal with it, and we'll get on with that. And rather than actually us helping to build the public realm, helping to use the power of the state to help deliver economic development activity. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that the Treasury has then set this out as a lump sum payment. It talks about are the tools timely, temporary, and targeted. And as you can see, lump sum payments get 3 thumbs up. Good news. Yeah. Repairs and maintenance, right, and infrastructure spending, which is the thing that's in the chart beforehand, 2 thumbs up and 1 maybe not. Despite the fact the evidence from the modelling tells us It's better than the lump sum payments, right? It's very difficult to see this essentially as anything other than the Treasury deciding the government's role is just to, in the event of a downturn, in the event of a fiscal crisis or an economic crisis, is just to step back and do as little as is possible so that you can protect your financial buffer, the money you've set aside for a rainy day, so that you can manage those risks without the government having to be involved. The government has very little role in the economy. This is something that's best left to technocrats inside the Reserve Bank, something that's best left to those who know better. And the last thing we want to see is elected officials doing any of this work.
Sellers inflation, what is it? And if during the next economic cycle we see a resurgence of sellers inflation, how would we use monetary policy to tackle that? So
many of the viewers and listeners on this call might remember during COVID that we saw inflation in particular areas spiral, right? For a brief period of time, top Auckland crime kingpins, right, were warehousing gibboard rather than meth, because gibboard was temporarily more valuable than meth in various parts of the country, right? Because we just didn't have any, and the prices for gibboard went through the roof. Yeah, that's sellers inflation, right? Where the rising costs of goods and services, right, were driven not by prices, not by costs, but by profit margins of companies. And we saw some companies make vast profit margins during COVID and in the period afterwards. Now, if we use monetary policy to help tackle that, it's fairly pointless. It does nothing. We put the cost of the interest rate up. It does nothing for a company that has an effective monopoly on a good or a service in New Zealand and says, stuff you, I just want more profit. The value of the demand might go down because we essentially make people poorer because we're going to put up their mortgages so much. But the profit margin means that those companies are insulated from that problem. This is, again, is where fiscal policy becomes really important. Why wouldn't we use fiscal policy to go out there and perhaps buy in more supply from overseas? Why wouldn't we use fiscal policy or government action to say, hang on a second, we have to stop that effective monopoly? Why not use fiscal policy to tackle that market failure, not just in the event of a disaster, but to tackle it right now? Why wouldn't we use fiscal policy right now to help tackle some of the supermarkets, energy markets, building materials, where we all know that we have problems, so that when we have a disaster, we have less of a disaster than we would do otherwise?
Treasury is proposing to make monetary policy the main vehicle because it thinks that the last response spent too much, causing inflation. Only you've written that it has no evidence to that effect. What does the IMF tell us about New Zealand and other nations compared to our level of inflation?
Well, essentially, that the view of the Treasury is that that during COVID there was a lot of stimulus went out of the door. The economy was tighter and hotter than many of us thought. That stimulus was added on top. We saw the cost of living get out of control, right? And this is the kind of standard explanation for why prices went quite so high in New Zealand during the period after COVID. Now, if we go to the next chart, what we can see is I've compared New Zealand's CPI to the CPI. So this is using IMF data. So this is internationally comparable data. And anybody can do this. You can just go online to the IMF and look at their data sets. I've compared New Zealand to 36 developed countries around the world, including the UK, including the US, Canada, Ireland, Singapore, Japan, Korea, a range of other jurisdictions. Now, I've left all those countries black or grey, but the red line on this chart is New Zealand. And what you can see is that New Zealand's chart is absolutely bang average for everywhere else in the developed world. That red line goes right through the middle of all of those countries during that period of time. New Zealand's inflation picture looks exactly the same as everywhere else. There's nothing interesting about it, both before and after COVID. In fact, we don't see the peak that some jurisdictions saw during COVID. Our peak is nowhere near the top of many European countries that were not only affected by COVID, but were then also affected by the conflict in the Ukraine. So our inflation story, really bang average inflation story. Really, there's not much to say or see here. The challenge is that that's not part of the prevailing orthodoxy when it comes to what happened in New Zealand and why we saw price rises, because either those price rises around the rest of the world were caused by New Zealand stimulus, which is clearly nonsense, or stimulus didn't have that effect on inflation in New Zealand, and it was driven by global factors, which essentially is what this chart shows here. But again, that doesn't fit with the current government story that we spent too much, and that gives them a reason for then rowing in what we're doing right now, particularly when the economy is about to go backwards again. And we've got even Simon Bridges demanding fiscal stimulus. In Auckland, unemployment in Auckland is 6.1%, but the government is using that story of we spent too much money to continue to make cuts right now, when this data shows us that's not what happened.
Now, the data that was publicized from the Treasury report, it talked about advanced economies, and it talked about New Zealand being comparatively at the high end when it came to a ratio. So our inflation was middle of the pack, like your graph just showed. But then they bring GDP into it, and they try and make out that New Zealand is at the high end. But the guys that are really, really similar to us, they're very, very almost exactly the same on those charts. So they're really hyping this up. What's your view on that?
Well, essentially what the Treasury is trying to do is trying to say that we spent a lot of money on COVID. We spent it with, according to one particular source, and we had the second highest level of COVID stimulus spending just after the USA. Fine, right? The challenge with that is that what do you call stimulus spending gets really hard to describe. So we labeled lots of our spending as COVID spending. That means that then gets called stimulus, whereas much of that stimulus was actually long-term. We made welfare changes that continued, right? That's not stimulus spending. That's just a welfare change, but it was labeled COVID at the time. We lent money to businesses. That money gets unwound over a long period of time. Is it stimulus? Or there's lots of things that we labeled here, and we're the victim of being too successful at labeling things as being COVID spending. So we did that. That therefore gets recorded as COVID spending. That's justification for why prices went up. Instead, if we'd done what lots of other jurisdictions did, which just simply was not to label it as COVID stimulus, the prices would have still gone up, because the prices were driven by global factors, not by the COVID stimulus in New Zealand. The other side of that story, of course, is that we have more than 20,000 people who are still alive in New Zealand as a consequence of the government's response to COVID. And that often gets lost in this conversation, because one of the consequences of this document might be that if we left cyclical management to the Reserve Bank, how would we respond to a disaster where life and limb was at risk again? Would we seriously just put aside all of the tools that could solve a problem, let the Reserve Bank deal with that, and say, you're just unlucky on the other side? I don't think that's an answer any government, not being party political, an answer any government could legitimately use or would use in New Zealand.
So, final question. They're trying to call leader of the opposition the $66 billion man, because $66 billion was spent, labeled COVID, as you say, labeled that way. And what we've got here is an ideological burp. And what's your overall reaction, having studied this, written about it, looked into it? What would you say to people in the media who are crowing that this is vindication for National and Treasury have proven that everything that Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon have been saying has been correct all along.
I wish it would make life a lot easier if it was that simple. It's just not true. The Treasury's own evidence doesn't support that. The evidence that we can see from other international indicators doesn't support that. If it were to be true, right, inflation in New Zealand is currently going up. It's 2.7%, right? But we're spending less. We're cutting investment. We're doing the opposite of what the previous government did. We're taking away investment. So how does that work if inflation's going up now, but we got less investment? Because now apparently it's international factors that are to blame, much as the previous government tried to say it was international factors. But at that point in time, the now opposition said, no, it's due to too much spending. There's no relationship between these two. There's no relationship between these two in a well-managed economy where you have an independent reserve bank and where over time you got very low levels of debt in comparison to other jurisdictions. On the IMF's net debt measure, New Zealand's debt is 23% of GDP. Yeah, in Australia it's 30. In the UK it's 92. In the US it's 95 and going north with Donald Trump. In Japan it's 135% of GDP. Right? We don't have a debt crisis in New Zealand. That means that we can't use the fiscal tools that are in front of us. We do in New Zealand have an investment crisis because we don't have the schools, the hospitals, the roads, the other things that we should do that ironically would help us manage a downturn or a business cycle or a disaster so much better. We would be able to, we wouldn't have to pump in so much money because we would have the systems and the buildings and the things that we needed already. We shouldn't be using this document as a means by which to simply, like the 1980s, say, government is dead. Let's just step back, step quietly into the background and not do anything. We've learned too much since then to adopt that as a system. We should have a much more sophisticated approach, which allows us to use all the tools available to us. And if we don't, the consequences of that, as we've seen in New Zealand's history and around the world, can be quietly devastating for lots of communities when a downturn does happen.
Thank you, Craig. That's been very comprehensive, and it's been excellent to interview you on your own podcast.
Thank you, Jared. And we look forward to having you back on this show and talking about issues close to you. But yeah, this is an important document. But there's and it sounds really dull, but it's got potentially far-reaching consequences for the next time we really have a problem in New Zealand.
Amen. Agreed.
Thank you for Jared for helping us out with so much with Here and Now on the Locked Out podcast. We hope that you found it in parts enjoyable and in parts enlightening and in parts maddening. Now, usually at this point in the show, I talk to you about some of the economic numbers that are floating around, but really, I just want to point your attention at one number. Now, it's not a number that often gets a lot of news. It's a bit strange, a number. Ready-mix concrete production. Now, I know what you're thinking. Craig's finally lost his mind. But ready-mix concrete production is a really important part of the construction cycle. It's a really important part of the construction market. Now, this year, the numbers are down 6% on June 2024. June 2024 numbers were down 11% from the June 2023 numbers. We now had 2 years where concrete production, which is integral to every building in the country, falling quite significantly year after year. Why is that important? We have 16,600 fewer people working in construction generally. Construction tends to lead where the rest of the economy tends to follow. And this downturn is another example of where the government's failing to actually deliver the right kind of stimulus, the right kinds of economic management, because if it were, we'll be seeing right now the best opportunity to deliver the new schools, the hospitals, the roads, the things that we all know that we need Instead, we're seeing in the concrete production statistics the slow strangling of the construction sector in New Zealand, and that population leaving to Australia, where that work is ongoing. So thank you for joining us here on Locked Out. We look forward to hearing from you. Don't work too hard. Goodbye.